Fade in. EXT. City Street. Evening. A busy urban setting. Cars honk. Pedestrians rush past, and streetlights flicker as the sun begins to set. A black man in his early 30s, James Parker, stands at the curb, glancing at his phone while waiting for a taxi. He's dressed in business casual attire, holding a leather briefcase. He exhales, exhausted after a long day at work. James VO. Softly, to himself, another long day. Just need to get home. He waves at an approaching yellow taxi. The cab slows down as if about to stop, but suddenly, it accelerates and speeds away. James, confused, checking his phone's GPS. That was my ride. He sighs and waves again. Another taxi appears. This time it stops. Taxi driver, 50s, white, slightly overweight, balding, with a gruff voice. Rolling down the window, looking James up and down suspiciously. Where you heading? James. Relieved, stepping forward, downtown. West 42nd Street. Taxi driver. Pausing, frowning, nah? Not taking that route tonight. There's an awkward silence. James glances at the empty back seat. James. Gesturing to the car, but your light's on. You're available. Taxi driver. Grumbling, avoiding eye contact, just not going that way. James narrows his eyes, realization dawning on him. He takes a breath, forcing himself to stay calm. James. Firmly, is it the route, or is it me? Taxi driver. Shifting uncomfortably, then shrugging. Look, man, I don't have to take every fare. That's my right. James clenches his jaw. A couple of bystanders glance over, sensing the tension. Bystander number 1, young woman, earphones in, whispering to a friend. Whispering, did he just refuse him? Bystander number 2, older man, crossing arms. Shaking his head, happens all the time. Ain't right. James exhales sharply, stepping back. The driver, feeling the scrutiny, mutters under his breath and pulls away. James watches the tail lights disappear, frustration simmering in his expression. Cut to int. Office building, earlier that day. A modern office space. James sits at his desk, rubbing his temples. His desk is covered in case files and reports. A coworker, Sarah, 30s, blonde, friendly, but exhausted, walks by, placing a coffee on his desk. Sarah, you look like you need this. James, grateful, taking the cup, you have no idea. She sits on the edge of his desk. Sarah, long day. James, long month. Had to meet with clients all over the city. You'd think in 2025, getting a taxi wouldn't be a problem anymore. Sarah, frowning, you mean? James, yeah, it still happens. Had a guy straight up ignore me last night. Sarah sighs, shaking her head. Sarah, that's ridiculous. You should report them. James, to who? The taxi commission? That's a joke. Complaints get reviewed, but nothing happens. Sarah looks at him sympathetically, but doesn't know what to say. James forces a tired smile. James, anyway, almost done for the day. Just need to get home in one piece. Back to present moment. James standing at the curb, watching another taxi drive by without stopping. Cut to EXT, same street. 5 minutes later. James is still waiting. A black woman, Lisa, 40s, professional, confident, approaches, also trying to get a cab. A taxi stops immediately for her. She starts getting in, then notices James standing there. Their eyes meet, and she reads the situation instantly. Lisa, pausing, looking at James, then at the driver. Wait a second. You didn't stop for him? The taxi driver number 2, Hispanic, MID 40s, nervously smiling, chuckles awkwardly. Taxi driver number 2. Didn't see him. Lisa, raising an eyebrow, unimpressed, right. She steps out of the cab. Lisa, take him first. The driver hesitates. Taxi driver number 2. Lady I. Lisa, crossing her arms, take him first. James, touched but also frustrated, shakes his head. James, it's okay. You don't have to do this. Lisa, firmly no? I do. The taxi driver grumbles, but James waves it off. James, really? I'll wait. He gives Lisa a grateful nod. She sighs, then gets into the taxi. The moment lingers as she watches James through the window, clearly disturbed by what just happened. Cut to int. Luxury penthouse, same night. A penthouse overlooking the city skyline. A well-dressed man in his late 50s, Richard Winters, a self-made billionaire, sips whiskey as he scrolls through his phone. His expression hardens as he watches a viral video of James's encounter, recorded by one of the bystanders. Richard's assistant, OS. Sir? Richard. Without looking up, get my driver. We're going for a ride. The screen fades to black. Fade in. EXT, City Street, later that night. James stands on the sidewalk, his patience wearing thin. More taxis pass him by, either ignoring him or stopping briefly before speeding away. He checks his phone and sighs. The frustration in his eyes is clear. James VO. Internal monologue, weary. How many times? How many times does this have to happen before something changes? He looks up at the city skyline, lost in thought. The bright lights of the city contrast with the dim reality he faces. He finally opens a ride-hailing app and requests a car. Cut to int. Richard Winters' luxury car, moving. A sleek black luxury car moves through the city streets. Inside, Richard Winters, the billionaire, watches the viral video on his phone. The clip, recorded by a bystander, clearly shows James being refused service. The camera shakes as murmurs from the crowd grow. Bystander in video, muttering in frustration. Man, this is still happening? The video ends with James shaking his head and stepping back as the taxi speeds off. Richard locks his phone screen, exhaling sharply. His expression is unreadable, somewhere between anger and determination. His driver, Thomas, 60s, well-dressed, ex-military precision, notices his mood. Thomas, something wrong, sir? Richard, just another example of why things don't change. Thomas, racism? Richard nods slightly, looking out the window. Richard, you'd think money and power would fix everything. Thomas, it fixes some things. Not ignorance. Richard stays silent, deep in thought. Richard, find that man. Thomas gives him a knowing look and nods. He picks up his phone and starts making calls as the city lights blur past them. James finally arrives home after taking a rideshare. He throws his bag onto the couch and sinks into a chair, rubbing his face. James, muttering to himself. Same damn story. He scrolls through his phone. A message from Sarah pops up. Sarah, text message. Hey, saw that video. It's going viral. People are talking about it. You okay? James sighs. He types back. James, text message. Yeah, just tired. He hesitates before adding another message. James, text message. I don't know why I'm even surprised anymore. He tosses his phone aside and stares at the ceiling. Cut to int. Richard Winters' office. Next morning. Richard sits at his massive glass desk, flipping through reports. His assistant, Karen, 40s, sharp, efficient, enters with a tablet. Karen. Sir, I found him. James Parker, 32. Works in corporate finance. No criminal record. Well-educated. Solid background. Richard smirks. Richard, did you expect otherwise? Karen. Of course not. But the driver? His name's Mike Reynolds. This wasn't the first time. He's been reported twice before for the same thing. Richard's expression darkens. Richard. And what happened? Karen. Nothing. Complaints were processed and then forgotten. Richard clenches his jaw. He taps his fingers on the desk before standing up. Richard, I want to meet James Parker. Today. Karen nods, already making the arrangements. Cut to int. James' office, later that day. James is at his desk, exhausted, scrolling through his phone when he gets a call from an unknown number. James. Answering hesitantly. Hello? Richard OS. James Parker? James. Yeah, who's this? Richard OS. My name is Richard Winters. I think we should meet. James frowns. James. Richard Winters, the billionaire? Richard OS. That's the one. I saw what happened to you last night. Meet me for lunch. My driver will pick you up in an hour. James is speechless for a moment, then scoffs. James. Why would you care? Richard OS. Because I've been on both sides of this city, and I'm done watching it happen. James hesitates, considering. Cut to int. High-end restaurant, private dining room, afternoon. A sleek, modern restaurant in the heart of the city. The kind of place where millionaires make deals over steak and wine. James sits at a private table, fidgeting slightly. He's never been in a place this luxurious before. Across from him, Richard Winters sits calmly, cutting into his meal. James, raising an eyebrow. So what's this really about? A billionaire suddenly caring about some guy getting passed over for a taxi? Richard, It's about more than just a taxi, James. James crosses his arms, still skeptical. James. Right. Because powerful men like you always go out of their way to help people like me. Richard leans back, studying James. Richard, you think I don't know what it's like to be shut out? Ignored? Underestimated? James laughs dryly. Forgive me if I find it hard to believe that a billionaire's had a hard time in life. Richard, my father was a janitor. My mother worked 2 jobs. People didn't take me seriously when I was young, but I learned how to fight back. And I did. James is silent for a moment, considering. James, so what do you want from me? Richard, I want to fix this. James scoffs, shaking his head. James, fix what? Racism? Good luck with that. Richard, I can't change the world overnight, but I can make sure that driver, Mike Reynolds, faces the consequences of his actions. And more importantly, I want to expose the system that lets guys like him keep getting away with it. James looks at Richard carefully. He doesn't fully trust him yet, but there's something different about this man. James, and how do you plan on doing that? Richard, we dig. We investigate. We don't just go after him. We go after the company that keeps covering for him. Cut to int. Taxi company headquarters, later that day. A cold, corporate office. Jason Coleman, 50s, polished, calculating. The CEO of the taxi company leans back in his leather chair, a forced smile on his face as he speaks to Richard and James. Jason, Mr. Winters, I respect your concern, but I assure you, our company has a strict policy against discrimination. Richard, then explain why Mike Reynolds still has a job after multiple complaints. Jason shifts uncomfortably, adjusting his tie. Jason, I can't speak on individual cases. James, cutting in. Because you don't want to. Jason's jaw tightens. Jason, look, Mr. Parker, these things are complicated. Sometimes it's a misunderstanding. Richard, leaning forward, voice sharp. And sometimes it's racism. Jason falls silent. Richard, we both know what's happening here. You've had complaints. You ignored them. You let it slide because it wasn't your problem. Jason, we don't condone racism. Richard, then prove it. Fire him. Publicly. Jason exhales sharply, now visibly frustrated. Jason, Mr. Winters, with all due respect, you can't strong-arm me into making a decision that affects my business. Richard, you sure about that? Richard slides a folder across the table. Jason hesitates before opening it. Inside are detailed reports, records of past complaints against Mike Reynolds, and evidence of similar incidents. Some of them have never been made public. Jason's face pales. Jason, where did you get this? Richard, I have my ways. Jason looks at the documents, sweating. Jason, what do you want? Richard, transparency, accountability, change. Fire him. Acknowledge the issue. Publicly announce a new anti-discrimination policy. Jason clenches his jaw, knowing he has no way out. Jason, fine. Richard smirks slightly. Richard, good. And while you're at it, issue a public apology to James. Jason glares, but nods stiffly. James watches in disbelief. He never thought he'd actually see someone held accountable. Cut to int. James' apartment, night. James sits on his couch, staring at his phone. The news is already spreading online. News reporter, VO. In a shocking turn of events, billionaire Richard Winters has forced a major taxi company to take action against long-ignored discrimination complaints. James shakes his head, still in disbelief. James, VO. Maybe, just maybe, things can change. Cut to EXT, City Street, day. A busy intersection. Taxi cabs whiz by. A large digital billboard above a building shows breaking news. Taxi company under fire after racist incident. CEO announces major policy reforms. James walks down the street, phone in hand, scrolling through the social media reactions. Tweets and posts flood the screen. Tweet number 1. Finally, someone holding these companies accountable. Props to Richard Winters. Tweet number 2. So sick of this happening. Racist drivers getting away with it for too long. Good to see real action. Tweet number 3. James Parker deserves an apology. No one should have to go through this in 2025. James sighs, still processing everything. His phone vibrates. An incoming call from Richard Winters. James. Picking up. Yeah? Richard. Turn on the news. James stops by an electronics store, where multiple TVs in the window display a live press conference. The taxi company CEO, Jason Coleman, stands behind a podium, flanked by executives. Cut to int. Press conference. Corporate headquarters. Live broadcast. Jason Coleman clears his throat, adjusting his tie. He's tense, visibly uncomfortable, but he speaks. Jason, in light of recent events, our company acknowledges its past failures in addressing discrimination. Effective immediately, we are implementing a zero-tolerance policy regarding racial bias among our drivers. Every complaint will be thoroughly investigated, and we will ensure strict consequences for violations. We apologize to Mr. Parker and anyone else who has experienced such treatment. Reporters fire questions. Jason hesitates, but then continues. Jason, we will also be investing in anti-discrimination training for all drivers and introducing a new passenger feedback system to ensure fair treatment for all riders. Cut to EXT, City Street, continuous. James watches, stunned. A small smile tugs at his lips. He never expected this kind of outcome. Richard Vio, this isn't just about you, James. It's about making sure the next person doesn't go through the same thing. James hangs up and takes a deep breath, letting it sink in. Cut to int. Radio station, interview room, later. A local radio station. James sits across from a well-known host, Danielle Thomas. The on-air sign glows red. Danielle, James Parker, your experience has sparked a national conversation. How does it feel seeing such a huge shift? James, nodding. It's surreal, but honestly, it's overdue. This happens every day to people who don't have a billionaire stepping in. That's what needs to change. Danielle, do you think this is enough? James thinks for a moment. James, it's a start. But policies only work if they're enforced. The real change happens when people actually start caring about doing the right thing without being forced. Cut to int. Taxi Driver Training Center, weeks later. A group of new taxi drivers sit in a training session, watching an instructor go through a presentation. Diversity and inclusion in transportation. The slides show real case studies, including James' incident. The instructor emphasizes fair treatment for all passengers. Cut to EXT, City Street, night. James steps to the curb. A taxi pulls up. The driver, a middle-aged man, Raheem, 50s, Middle Eastern descent, greets him with a warm smile. Raheem, where to, sir? James hesitates, recalling his last experience. Then he exhales and gets in. James, just drive, man. The taxi pulls away, the city lights glowing around them. Cut to int. Coffee shop, 1 month later. A cozy cafe, bustling with people. James Parker sits by the window, sipping his coffee. His phone buzzes, a news notification. He clicks it open. Headline: Taxi industry faces overhaul after viral racism controversy. Nationwide reform in progress. James scrolls through the article. The camera lingers on key phrases. Text on screen. Major taxi companies implementing anti-bias training. Laws proposed for stricter discrimination policies in public transport. Tech-based solutions for monitoring driver behavior introduced. James shakes his head in disbelief. A month ago, he was just another guy trying to get a ride. Now he's part of something much bigger. Cut to int. TV studio, national interview. James sits across from a well-known journalist, Susan Graham. The bright studio lights shine down as the cameras roll. Susan, James, your experience resonated across the country. Do you think real change is happening? James, it's starting. But it's not just about me. It's about every person who's faced discrimination and had no voice. What happened that night exposed something deeper, something people deal with every day. Susan, and what about Richard Winters? He played a huge role in making this go viral. James, he didn't just step in with money. He stepped in with power. He forced a conversation people were avoiding. But the real power? That came from everyone who spoke up, who shared the story, who demanded change. Susan, do you think this incident will have a lasting impact? James, it has to. Because if we stop pushing, nothing changes. If we keep the pressure, we can make sure no one else has to fight just to get a ride home. Susan nods, impressed. The camera zooms in on James. His voice now carries weight beyond just his own experience. Cut to EXT, City Streets, future flash forward. The streets look the same, but there's a subtle shift. A woman of color hails a cab. It stops immediately. A young black man gets in a rideshare. No hesitation from the driver. Signs in taxis now display ride fair, zero tolerance for discrimination. Voiceovers from past news reports echo over the scene. Reporter 1 VO. Thanks to widespread protests and public outcry, major policy changes are taking effect. Reporter 2 VO. More cities are introducing driver accountability systems to prevent racial bias in ride services. Richard Winters VO. This was never about one man's ride. It was about changing the way we treat each other, everywhere. Cut to int. Taxi company boardroom, 1 year later. A conference room filled with executives. A new policy document sits in the center of the table. Anti-discrimination protocols, 2026. A woman in a suit, Danielle Ruiz, CEO, addresses the room. Danielle, this isn't just PR. We're setting a new industry standard. Our competitors are watching. The government is watching. Most importantly, the people are watching. The executives nod in agreement. The company has changed. The industry has changed. Cut to int. Taxi driver break room. Same time. A group of drivers watches a training video on a small screen. The title reads, Diversity and Ethics in Passenger Services. The instructor emphasizes respect, equality, and fair treatment for all customers. A driver turns to his colleague and shakes his head. Driver 1. Man, crazy how fast things changed. Driver 2. Yeah, but honestly, it's about time. Cut to int. James' apartment, night. James sits at his desk, looking at a folder labeled Civil Rights Advocacy Group, Application. He hesitates for a moment, then picks up a pen and starts filling it out. His phone rings. It's Richard Winters. James smirks before answering. James, you know, I never got to thank you properly. Richard, then don't. Just make sure the next person doesn't have to go through what you did. James nods to himself. He looks back at the application, his next step in turning personal pain into real action. Cut to EXT, City Street, full circle moment. A taxi pulls up to the curb. James gets in. The driver, a young black man, smiles. Driver, where to, sir? James, grinning. Just drive, man. The taxi merges into traffic as the city buzzes around them. This time, James doesn't have to question whether he belongs. The world is still far from perfect, but today, it's a little better than it was yesterday.